Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has joined us again. Welcome back, folks. At this time, let me inquire of the defense to see if there is an opening statement on behalf of Mr. Holmes. Mr. King?
Yes, please, Your Honor.
All right, you may proceed.
James Holmes's notebook, written in the weeks right before the shooting. We are all one unity. As such, there is no difference between life and death or space-time. All things, actions, and phenomena are not multiple ripples. Instead, the universe is a single unitary preponderance of which we are each part of. This may be unfathomable to some and result in the seeking of escapism and attempt at redactionisms of unity into fractured entities. To me, this unity is infinitely complex. Much more preferable is a simple system. Unity through nil. Why? 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 Why does the value of a person even matter? If life has no value, all is just. Life and death are not demarcated. Any and all actions have no impact on anything. Moral imbeciles are those who side with zero or negative infinity. The ideals of society are founded on positive infinity. Why? Why? Why do persons commit to zero or negative infinity? All men are created equal, and all men are uncreated equal. But in between, there is inequality. Why? Multiplying both sides of an equation by zero when mankind can't find truth, untruth is converted to truth via violence times zero. Problem equals question mark. Zero times problem equals question mark times zero. Based on an incorrect theorem, zero equals zero. Problem solved. I have spent my entire life seeking this alternative so that the questions of how to live and what to live for may be addressed. When James Holmes stepped into that theater in July of 2012, he was insane. His mind had been overcome by a disease of the brain that had plagued him and pursued him for years. In his words, I have fought for years and years to overcome my biology. But in the end, when florid psychosis erupted in 2012, he lost that struggle. He lost that struggle in his mind to a disease called schizophrenia. And he was not in control. He was not in control of his thoughts. He was not in control of his actions. He was not in control of what he perceived to be reality, but was in fact not reality, but psychotic delusion. By the time Mr. Holmes stepped into that theater, his perception of reality was so skewed, was so malformed, that he no longer lived in the world that we live in, the same reality. But to him, it seemed as real as this seems to you right now. He was pursued, he was commanded, and he was compelled. Pursued by psychotic delusions that controlled him and told him that he had to do this act. Commanded by intrusive thoughts, unwanted thoughts that would come into his brain telling him to kill. Since he was a sophomore in high school. And finally, when the psychosis really bloomed, he was compelled. He was compelled to act. There was no choice to be made. Through his psychosis, he felt as if he was possessed. There were no other options. There were no choices. There was no rational consciousness operating. This is not the conscious choice of a rational mind. This is about a brain disease, a diseased mind, and about the power of psychotic delusion and how it can take everything away from a person. How it can take away the person's ability to form their own intentions and their own desires and replace them with the commands of the delusion. It's about how it can take away from somebody the ability to perceive and understand reality, and therefore the ability to understand and perceive and distinguish between what's right and what's wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you on a very sad occasion. And with your permission, I humbly ask that I be allowed to discuss with you, first, a little bit about how you should approach this solemn duty that you are embarking on, and a little bit about the roles in the law that would apply to your decision making. And second, with the help of Ms. Spangler, I want to describe for you a little bit about what our presentation during the course of this trial will be. Because the story Mr. Brockler told you is not the whole story. It's only a part of the story. My name is Daniel King. And I, along with my colleagues, Catherine Spangler, Tamara Brady, Rebecca Higgs, Kristen Nelson, represent Mr. James Holmes. At the end of this trial, I too will stand before you And all I will ask, all I'm going to ask, is that you accept reality. A reality that the prosecution has chosen not to accept because it doesn't suit their purposes. The reality is mental illness. But I'm concerned. And I think we need to talk about that further. The magnitude of what took place in that theater as a human event is impossible for us to even comprehend. The suffering and the pain that have been endured and continue cannot be quantified and cannot be qualified. And I'm not going to try to do that. We're social creatures. And when something like this happens, it strikes down deep inside our human core. We feel sad. We feel angry. We want to stand for our way of life, for our community. The ripples of effect of this event extend out in every direction. To the community, to the first responders, to the treatment providers, and mostly to those whose lives were irrevocably changed or ended, or those who had loved ones whose lives ended just because they chose to attend a movie. These feelings are human and natural and right for us to feel as human beings. But ladies and gentlemen, I am concerned because that river runs deep. And you're not just human beings, you're now jurors. And you've sworn an oath. And part of that oath, as the judge just instructed you, is that neither sympathy nor prejudice may affect your deliberations. I don't know how you're going to do that. You're being asked to set aside fundamental human emotions. I don't know how you're going to do that. But that's your task. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm concerned because as I stand before you now, I feel a great wave of pain and emotion from this community and from these victims. Such a flood of pain that nothing can stand in its way in this case. What I'm going to suggest to you through the course of this trial is that when the flood waters rise, the only thing to do is to move above the waterline together. There is the fortress of the law. Here is the fortress of the law. And here, in this space, you will make the decisions, the life-changing decisions that you're being asked to make. There is no room in the fortress of the law for hatred. There is no room for retribution or vengeance. The law commands that you decide one thing and one thing only, that you fairly and rationally consider all the evidence in the case or the lack of evidence, and you decide at the end of the day whether the prosecution has proven to your satisfaction beyond any reasonable doubt that Mr. Holmes was not insane when he stepped into that movie theater. Not whether mass murder is wrong, not how badly the victims were harmed, not about gun control, not about mental health treatment. Not here. Not here in the fortress of the law. You'll be instructed that in making your decision beyond reasonable doubt, you're to consider this as if it were a matter of importance to yourself. And you should, because this is a matter of utmost importance to the victims, to the community, and to Mr. Holmes and his family. We all have roles here. And the judge is here to instruct you on what the law is. The prosecutors are advocates. Do not forget that. They seek the conviction and death of James Holmes and nothing else. And I'm concerned because the prosecutor representing the government, your government, just stood before you and talked about the horrors of what took place in the movie theater. And I saw the impact on your faces. And he talked about the vast amount of evidence that they're going to present about what took place in the movie theater and at the apartment. But nothing that took place there is contested by the defense. Mr. Holmes has entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, essentially admitting that he was the person in the theater pulling the trigger. Nevertheless, apparently, based on what we've just heard, we're going to be presented with days and days, perhaps weeks, of testimony and evidence about what happened in that theater. And when you hear that evidence, understand that we're not contesting and ask why it's being presented. I, too, am an advocate. When this is over, you can grade my paper of performance, and I hope I get a passing score. Our role here is to insist that Mr. Holmes be treated fairly and be afforded a certain amount of human dignity as a human being who's suffering from a severe mental illness called schizophrenia. As I said to you before, the way above the waterline in this case is the way of understanding. The road to higher ground in this case is the path of the truth. We, the defense, in this case, have been doggedly pursuing the truth since the 20th of July, 2012, and we continue to do so. We, the defense, are not afraid of the truth in this case. We accept the truth, and we will ask you to do the same. So let's talk about the truth of mental illness. We talked about this in jury selection, and I want to clear up a couple definitions so that we all are on the same page. Schizophrenia, or schizophrenia spectrum disorder, as all of the experts in this case have diagnosed Mr. Holmes with, is a brain disease. It's a brain disease just as cancer is a body disease. It's inherited. People don't choose schizophrenia. It comes in their genes, just like a propensity for heart disease or cancer is inherited genetically. It's a psychotic disease, which is all the psychiatrists have diagnosed Mr. Holmes with, the psychotic disease. Psychosis is a break with reality. It's a reflection that the person is not basing their decisions upon reality, but is basing their decisions and their thoughts upon internal stimuli. But the person doesn't perceive that. The person perceives it as being real and logical, even though it's not. Psychosis has several symptoms: disorganized speech and thought. Hallucinations are when someone sees or hears things that aren't there, but they perceive them as being real. Mr. Holmes suffered from hallucinations, and you'll hear about that. And finally, the most powerful of all is delusions. Delusions are fixed false beliefs that are maintained in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So someone may have a delusion that the FBI is spying on them, or they may have a delusion that someone loves them when they don't, or they may have a delusion that they're being controlled by aliens. And in the space of overwhelming evidence that this is not true, they persist in that belief. Why? Because to them it is as real as the sun rising in the morning. We heard a lot about the planning that went into this. And there's a common misconception, I think, that says people with mental illnesses cannot plan. Mr. Holmes could not possibly have been insane, because look at what he was able to do. You'll be told by the psychiatrist that there is nothing inconsistent between mental illness and planning. People who have severe mental illnesses think, plan, act, live. The question is not can they plan, but what are they planning for? Is it a logical, goal-oriented objective? Or is it an illogical, delusional objective that makes no sense? That's the crucible of insanity, not planning. There's an inclination, I think, that when something terrible happens to insist that somebody has to be to blame. And mental illness can sure sound like an excuse. But in this case, it's not. The illness is real. It can overwhelm lives. There will be no doubt in your minds by the end of this trial that Mr. Holmes is severely mentally ill. None. In the 32 months since he's been incarcerated, he's been evaluated and treated in person by more than 20 doctors. 20 doctors. These are psychiatrists, psychologists, the team of doctors that treated him when he had to be hospitalized at Denver General for psychosis, neuropsychologists, neuropsychiatrists, doctors from the state hospital in Pueblo, doctors appointed by the court, doctors hired by the defense. Every single one of them agrees of two things. Number one, Mr. Holmes suffers from a serious psychotic mental illness that shapes and forms his thoughts and actions. And number two, Mr. Holmes is not malingering. Malingering means faking. Mr. Holmes has undergone hours and hours of interrogation. Every psychological test that you can imagine, every neuropsychological test that you can imagine, every measure of faking, lying, you name it, that the world of psychiatry and psychology has to offer. And every single clinician who has actually seen Mr. Holmes will tell you there is no evidence that he's faking anything, and there is ample evidence that he's not faking anything. Mr. Brockler talked to you about some inconsistencies that he perceived between the things that Mr. Holmes said to different doctors. The doctors will tell you these are not differences. They will tell you that these are not significant and do not mean that he's not telling the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, all we're asking in this case is that you accept the reality of mental disease, and you can answer all the questions that need answering in this case, including the question of why. Accept the reality that people get sick. For some, cancer will strike an organ or a limb. For others, schizophrenia will strike at their mind. Accept that those who are suffering from psychosis do not live in the same reality and perceive the same reality that we do. Accept that people don't choose their mental illness or the types of delusions that they suffer from. Accept the fact that a psychotic individual is not making the same kind of choices that the rest of us do. Accept the fact that someone who's suffering from psychosis perceives what's right and what's wrong as they perceive everything else through the psychosis, through that veil. So how should we go about this process of understanding the truth and moving to higher ground? In this case, you're going to hear from a number of different doctors. There are subtle differences in the doctor's opinions. And I liken this to matching paint. I got some paint from my house. It's a red paint. And I go to the paint store and I say, I need to match this paint. It's red. And the expert says, the paint expert says, actually, that's more like a brick or a rose or scarlet or crimson. And I say, well, that looks like red to me. And the expert says, well, it is red. But if you're an expert, you can perceive subtle differences. And perhaps there's another expert in the store, and he comes over and says, I think you may be wrong. That doesn't look so much like brick. It looks more like scarlet to me, a little bit more scarlet. But they all agree that it's a color. They all agree that it's a bright color. And they all agree that it's a red color. That's what we're talking about in this case. Every one of the experts has diagnosed Mr. Holmes with a schizophrenia spectrum disorder. There are different subtle nuances within that range. And we'll talk about that. What the experts will tell you is when you're making a diagnosis, you look at the present symptoms that someone is displaying. And then you try to trace those symptoms back in time to figure out where they came from, to figure out the entire history in order to make an accurate diagnosis of what's going on. So I want to talk to you about the hard evidence of mental illness that describe the nature and depth of Mr. Holmes' brain disease. First, I want to talk to you about the one bookend, the evidence of mental illness since the crime. And then I want to go back in time to his childhood and see if we can discover where this came from and why this happened. And then I'm going to sit down and Ms. Spangler will stand and she will describe for you
the psychotic process as it unfolded in Mr. Holmes' mind during 2011 and 2012, that school year. Because as you will hear, schizophrenia lies latent in people. There are signs of it when you're a child or when you're developing through adolescence. But it blossoms into full psychosis when individuals are in their early 20s, the same age that Mr. Holmes was when it happened to him. That's when the psychosis erupts. So what does the disease picture look like now? Ms. Spangler will talk to you about the bookend of before the crime. But I want to touch on just a few things because Mr. Brockler left some important facts out when he described those months. First of all, Mr. Holmes told others. Secondly, he sought help. Third, he documented his thoughts and symptoms. He told his friends that he was having thoughts of killing other people. And his girlfriend, Ms. Dada, told him he needed to see a psychiatrist. She knew something was wrong. He sought help. He voluntarily went to a psychiatrist and went back again and again and again. And what Mr. Brockler failed to tell you is that this psychiatrist we can add to the list of 20 other doctors because she felt that he was functioning at a psychotic level back in March of 2012. She felt that he may be shifting into a frank psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia. And he documented in his notebook the delusions that were controlling his mind. And when you read it, you will say, this makes no sense. Dr. Jeffrey Metzner, one of the court-appointed psychiatrists, said that when he first saw the notebook, he described it as being full of a whole lot of crazy. Let's think about this crime as an event. Because when Mr. Holmes stepped into that theater, he was a young man who had never done anything wrong his entire life. He was raised by loving and caring parents in San Diego, California, and Central California. His parents are hardworking, middle-class people who taught him the right things, who took him to church. And he was a good kid. He tried hard. He did well. There's no record of him ever harming anyone that we can find. And we've talked to everybody. There's no record of him manipulating anyone or bullying anyone.
He never got a speeding ticket until he came to the state of Colorado. He worked hard. He got good grades. He did the right things and wanted to make something out of himself. He was what we all want our children to be like.
Objection. Overruled.
You know, Mr. Holmes happens to be Bob and Arlene Holmes' son. But he really could be anyone's. Because schizophrenia doesn't play favorites. And when it strikes, it robs the individual of their reality. That is the person who then, for the first time doing anything wrong in 24 years, steps into this movie theater and commits this unspeakable crime.
for no reason. The reason is that he has a psychotic delusion that he thinks it will somehow increase his self-worth, his human capital. It's nonsense. But to him, it was so real and so powerful that nothing else mattered. It had to be done. And he threw everything away, not on purpose, but because he was controlled by the delusions. His entire life, his family. He now regrets what took place in the theater. There's no rational explanation for what took place. People do things for reasons, folks. People commit crimes for reasons. Money, revenge, anger, hatred, political, religious reasons, make a statement. Maybe they think it's fun. None of those apply to Mr. Holmes. You can run at this from any direction you want, and you will not come up with a reason that makes any sense. Because it doesn't. I find myself, and you will find yourself too, trying to put rational, logical reasons to what's going on. Trying to attribute logic to what Mr. Holmes was thinking. But you can't do that because there's no logic to it. It's based on delusion and unreality. After the crime took place, Mr. Holmes stepped out of the theater into the parking lot, and he did nothing. He stood there. All of the elaborate planning that had gone on had gone away because he was done. He stood there, and they arrested him. And the officers that arrested him described him as being out of touch, staring off into space, disoriented, dripping with sweat. They described him, when they took him into custody, as offering no resistance whatsoever. Not even normal involuntary muscle resistance, the officers say. It's just totally limp. He's brought to the Aurora Police Department. He's placed in a room.
Huh? What? What? What?
Paper bags are put on his hand to preserve evidence. And he's asked, what are these for? And he says, popcorn. It's concrete thinking. It's a symptom of schizophrenia. He also repeats back what the officers are saying. Echolalia. It's a symptom of schizophrenia. He also exhibits disorganized behavior with these bags. And you'll be told by the experts that people with schizophrenia exhibit disorganized, nonsensical, even childlike behavior in inappropriate circumstances.
In your hands, but just bear with me, just leave them on there, we'll get them off before we see what we can, okay? Trust me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh?
Is it because of those things?
What things?
What's this for?
Huh?
What's this for?
We just want to make sure that your hands are protected.
Protected?
Yeah. Do you know what this is for?
That's what I'm asking.
Huh?
That's what I'm asking.
What do you think it's for?
Popcorn.
For popcorn?
Yeah.
Could be used for popcorn. But not right now.
We're left alone for hours. It goes on and on and on. On On Monday, July 22nd, Mr. Holmes appeared in court for the first time, and he sat right there with Ms. Brady sitting next to him. The way he appeared is the way he was. That was the first time Ms. Brady had ever met Mr. Holmes in court that day. I had met him with Mr. Gonglak on the 20th when he was booked into the county jail. We saw him for about 10 minutes in a holding cell. His appearance speaks for itself. The deputies that you'll see in this video who escorted him to court noticed that he was disoriented, unsteady on his feet, that he seemed to stare off at things in space, that they had to steady him as he walked down the corridors to the court. One day later, on July 24th, 2012, we retained a neurologist and psychiatrist from the Denver area named Dr. Jonathan Woodcock. And we asked Dr. Woodcock to visit Mr. Holmes in the jail and to tell us what he thought, to report his observations and thoughts. Dr. Woodcock talked with Mr. Holmes about his present symptoms and his history, and he concluded that without any doubt, he thought Mr. Holmes was floridly psychotic at the time. And he gave him a tentative diagnosis at the time of schizoaffective disorder, which is in the schizophrenia spectrum of disorders that I've described. That's still his opinion today. Following that, Mr. Holmes remained isolated in the jail. He saw no one other than the lawyers that visited him and the deputies that fed him. He continued to display odd, nonsensical behaviors. He continued to communicate delusional, psychotic thoughts. He continued with the bizarre behaviors. And while he was in the jail, he continued writing. And he wrote, this is before he was medicated, he wrote a continuation of what you saw in the notebook. And Ms. Spangler will describe these delusions to you in greater detail. But it's an elaborate construct of human capital and a nonsensical construct, a psychotic construct, and all of the beliefs and the thoughts that he had when he was writing in the notebook before the crime, he maintained and still had in the jail. That's a delusion. He still believed that his human capital had been increased. He still does today. That's how powerful this delusion is. He still believes this stuff today, despite the fact that he has been medicated for more than 2 years and is sitting here listening to me now and has heard all this before. Dr. Gurr, the psychiatrist, will tell you that psychosis is a fluid process, that it can start when we're very young and you get signs of it, but that even when someone reaches full maturity, there are good days and bad days, good months and bad months. So while Mr. Holmes remained floridly psychotic in the jail, he was basically stable. He was able to eat his meals, take his visitors, read books, and sit on his bed. But in November 2012, things got markedly worse for Mr. Holmes. And the experts will tell you that this was not due to a delirium caused by him not eating and drinking. It will be abundantly clear to you that he ate and drank through this entire time, in addition to be given IV fluids. Rather, the experts from Denver General will tell you that he was psychotic, experiences psychiatric symptoms. During this period of time in the jail, he describes later that he was experiencing other psychotic symptoms. Ideas of reference, for one. Ideas of reference are when you attach magical importance to normal events. For him, He thought that President Obama was communicating to him through the television. When he saw President Obama on the television, President Obama would wink at him or make movements. And from that, he inferred that President Obama knew what had happened in the theater and knew about the human capital ideas and agreed with them. While he was in the jail during this period of time, he experienced hallucinations, both visual and audio hallucinations. He experienced, while in the jail during this period, what are called thought broadcasting. He believed that the others in the jail could read his thoughts and understand what was going on. On November 11th, 2012, deputies observed Mr. Holmes stand on his bed in his cell and fall backwards. He later told experts that this was a trust fall of sorts, and he was expecting to be caught. November 11th, 2012. Inmate seen to assess needs for current suicide or needs. Inmate asked why he was placed on a suicide watch, and he stated, "I'm scared of what I will do." When further asked, he said, "I'm trying to keep it all together." When asked to explain, he said, "The system, all the systems." When asked if he felt like this was a lot for one person to do, he said yes. When asked why he fell backwards off his bed, he looked at the deputy and said, "I do not know if you are real." And the deputy believed him. He appeared authentic and showed what appeared to be nervousness and had a trembling voice. He was brought from that cell to a rubber room called BC5, Behavioral Control 5. This is a room without any furniture. It's a room lined with a hardish plastic. There's no toilet. There's a grate on the floor for the prisoner to urinate or defecate into. The prisoner is stripped of their clothing, and they're given a suicide gown. November 12th, did not come to the door to get breakfast, observed to lie face down on floor with arms under himself and pull at an empty sack bag as if trying to get something out of it. He later was observed to take suicide sack breakfast and toss it down the toilet grate. Remains naked, demonstrating odd behaviors, licking the wall, rearranging the blankets, attempting to open the window. Attempts to communicate are ignored and given a blank stare. Unable to communicate. Ate lunch meat between two flattened cups. Ate the paper, too. Did backward somersaults with a cup balanced on his penis during the trick. Noted to be sucking his thumb and crying. The inmate was carried from one cell to another on a blanket. He was unable to walk. He did not respond verbally. His lips moved as if to speak, but no sound came out. His sclera, his eyes, were bloodshot and tearful. They couldn't get a pulse because of the stiffening of body. He attempted to go into a catatonic state, lying on his stomach with his arms twisted and his legs up in the air, bent at the knees. I observed Holmes lying naked in the cell, November 13th. This is 48 hours. Not covered with the blanket. There were feces in the cell. The smell smelled like urine and old foodstuffs. Due to unsanitary conditions, he was moved. He had fecal matter on his feet and didn't notice. He was taken to Denver General and given a CAT scan. On the way to the hospital, because he kept running his head into the wall. On the way to the hospital, he kept repeating in the ambulance over and over and over again, "You can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can't teach an old dog new tricks." He was given an IV in the ambulance. He was given an IV at the hospital. He returned to the jail, and the psychosis continued. I saw Holmes standing at the wall, hitting his head on the wall opposite the cell door. He then backed up to the drain in the cell and ran into the wall head first. He fell backwards, falling on the floor by the drain. He kept saying things like, "There's a shadow. Where's the shadow? You're a shadow. Where's Father?" After hitting his head, he was crying and ranting out, saying, "I see shadows, you're a shadow." They tried to give him an EKG, but he was shaking, and they were unable to complete the task. Many of the behaviors you see in these videos are expressions of another severe psychotic symptom called catatonia, where the person is rigid and unable to move. And you heard a description of that earlier. Eventually, Mr. Holmes was deemed to not be able to be taken care of in the jail. They couldn't manage him anymore. This is where he runs into the wall. The psychologist from the jail wrote an affidavit and filed it in court to have him sent to a psychiatric hospital. And she noted all the behaviors that we've been talking about. The ranting, the talking to people that weren't there, licking the wall, eating paper, smearing feces on himself. Sounded like Mr. Brockler was suggesting that Mr. Holmes might have done this for notoriety. Look at the video, and you tell me if you would do this for notoriety. He was sent to Denver General Hospital, and he was taken in an intake there. And this is the affidavit written by the psychologist from the jail that talks about all the symptoms and asks that he be committed. Upon intake at Denver General, he's treated by a team of psychiatrists, and they determine that he is psychotic. He's hearing voices, up to 8 voices at a time, you'll see in the note. He's got paranoid delusions going on. He presents psychotic with catatonic features, been engaging in bizarre behavior, disorganized thought process, perseverating on food and drink, responding to internal stimuli, endorsed hallucinations, on and on and on. When he first arrives, he's unable to speak at all, just repeating things like point, counterpoint, point, counterpoint. They give him Haldol, a powerful antipsychotic medication, and he improves rather immediately to some degree. Dr. Caldwell, who's the head of emergency medicine at Denver General, will testify, and he'll tell you he was the first person to assess Mr. Holmes right after he'd been given the Haldol. And at that point, Mr. Holmes responded to him. He asked him a question. Mr. Holmes would look at him and talk back, but not in English, in gibberish. They diagnose him with psychosis not otherwise specified because they don't know the history. They don't know where it came from. All they know is he's presenting as floridly psychotic right now.
What was it like last night?
We were able to take this video, the 20th of November, which is the day he's discharged from the hospital. This is when he's been on medication for 4 days, and he's better.
I think it was the blankets putting on my head, like hiding under the covers.
Where were you hiding from?
Just like I was trying to hide from shadows, so under the blankets there should be any shadows there.
There were a lot of shadows last night.
Yep.
So part of what gets busy at night, or?
Oh, I would say so, yeah.
What's that like for you?
Scary, I guess.
Are the shadows, are they nice or mean or just mysterious, or what about them scares you?
Sometimes they're nice, but typically they're prying and forceful.
They speak to you?
Yep.
You were ready when they said it? Or what did they say to you?
Generally, not to do something.
So you generally they're telling you not to do certain things?
Yeah. Orders to do something.
Or like orders to do something. We went back and found the surveillance video from the night before that he's describing, and lo and behold, he is trying to hide under
The sheets. And when they take the blanket from him, he hides under the sheet. And they take the sheet from him, and he gets the fitted sheet off the bed and tries to curl up under that in a fetal position. And when they take that from him, he tries to climb under the mattress. When he returned to the jail, he told the staff psychiatrist at the jail, Dr. Mosier, that when he was there, he thought he was Peter Pan in a green vest, and that he was in a shadow box, a game, and it was not a fun game. Since returning from the hospital in November of 2012, Mr. Holmes has continued taking the antipsychotic medication that he was prescribed in the jail, and it's had a positive effect on him. Antipsychotic medication doesn't cure schizophrenia, though. It's important that you know this. It lessens the symptoms. It can lessen the hallucinations. It can lessen the confusion. It can lessen the power of the delusion sometimes. But it doesn't cure schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a lifelong disease, a chronic, deteriorative, lifelong disease. And he still has it to this day and still has the same delusions to this day. But all of the psychiatric and psychological evaluations he's been under have been while he's been medicated. And all of the doctors will tell you that will have a significant effect on lessening the symptoms. You may notice as he sits here in court that he appears distracted or aloof or unconnected. And that's in part because of the medication that he's on. You should not assume that this is the way he looked or acted before he was medicated, because it's not. Interestingly enough, that trip to the hospital interrupted a visit from a new psychiatrist that we had hired. At that point, we knew we were dealing with something serious, and we engaged in a search for a psychiatrist. And we decided, and you should too, that we wanted to hire somebody not who was paid to be a talking head. Think about this. If you had suffered from a serious injury, if you needed heart surgery, would you want someone who was experienced in heart surgery to give you that surgery? Someone who was trained and treated people in hospitals every day? Or would you want the doctor who appears on the nightly news and gives commentary to perform your heart surgery for you? Nowadays, there are a lot of talking heads out there with a lot of opinions, but we wanted someone who was a true expert. Dr. Raquel Gurr is one of the foremost experts in psychotic disease in the world. She doesn't normally work on criminal cases. She works at the University of Pennsylvania, where she runs the psychiatric program there, where she teaches and treats patients and does research with million-dollar grants into schizophrenia and studies the brain and how these things are developed. She's probably talked to more psychotic people than any other doctor that I'm aware of. Thank you. We chose her and we asked her to work on the case. You'll hear she doesn't work on a lot of cases. She's worked on very few. She worked on Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. She worked on Jared Loughner, the mass shooting down in Tucson. She has worked on a few others. When Sandy Hook took place, she was summoned to the White House by the president and the vice president for a task force because of her expertise in schizophrenia and mass violence. I want to quickly go back in time with you and talk a little bit about how this developed and how it formed. As I told you before, schizophrenia is inherited. So it's important that you look at family history to see if there's a history of mental illness. And in Mr. Holmes's case, he was both blessed and cursed by his genetics because he's a very smart person, but he was also loaded for mental illness. I just want to talk about a couple people. This is Robert Holmes Sr. He is Mr. Holmes' paternal grandfather, his father's father. He was a very successful man, a career Army officer, a military planner, I think, strategist. And he first experienced his mental illness when he was a cadet at West Point. And later on in life, it went on to the point where it clearly and massively disabilitated him. The patient has been totally disabled through his treatment by this psychiatric disorder. On the other side of his family, this is his maternal grandfather, Burton Egan. Mr. Egan also suffered from psychotic illness. You can see here he was hospitalized and diagnosed with psychosis. By family reports, this was an occasion when he was working as a parking lot attendant and he started not making sense and handing out money to people rather than collecting it from them. He was diagnosed with atypical psychosis. He was hospitalized a second time. And during this, family members related that he was wandering around the yard of the family home in Carmel, California, naked, not making sense. This is Mr. Holmes' paternal aunt, the fraternal twin of his father. Ms. Holmes didn't cooperate with us because of the paranoid nature of her delusional disease. But you can see from that letter from her psychiatrist that she has been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, a variation of schizophrenia, the same disease that Dr. Woodcock has diagnosed Mr. Holmes with. She's been disabled for most of her life. She takes psychiatric medication, and even with all those supports, even with the medication and the psychiatrist, and having had this disease for 30 or more years, she still periodically gets bad enough that she has to be hospitalized. Quickly, schizophrenia develops with the negative symptoms first. Psychosis comes later. First come the negative symptoms: emotional withdrawal, apathetic, lack of interest in things. And this is what's reflected in Mr. Holmes' change in his personality as a child. When he was in elementary school, he was a completely social, normal child. Interacted with other kids, played sports, was completely normal and interactive. When he moved into middle school and high school, things changed dramatically. He withdrew from everything. He started to feel like he was different. He started to think about suicide and attempted suicide at the age of 11, something Dr. Gurr will tell you doesn't happen unless there's something seriously wrong. And then it got worse. When he was a sophomore in high school, he began to have intrusive, unwanted thoughts in his brain telling him to kill people. And those thoughts continue to this day. Nobody noticed that the mental illness at this early age. Why? Because he was getting straight A's. And he was causing no problem. And he was a good kid. Continued on into undergraduate school, where he started to experience hallucinations, and the intrusive thoughts continued. And eventually, when he was accepted at the University of Colorado, his father asked to drive him for a road trip to go. And Mr. Holmes said no. And he got into his car and he headed off himself to try to fight against his biology by learning about his mind. Ms. Spangler.
Mr. King just spoke with you about the importance in evaluating mental illness, and specifically James Holmes' schizophrenia, in looking at both what was happening to Mr. Holmes both prior to and following the tragic events of July 20th of 2012. Mr. King brought you back in time to James Holmes' normal middle-class upbringing in Southern California, a time when you heard that Mr. Holmes, in the way that he interacted with the world as a teen, as a child, as a young adult, is fully consistent with the beginning stages of schizophrenia. Mr. King brought you forward in time to the days and the weeks and the months following the shooting, specifically to November of 2012, when James's mind once again rapidly deteriorated and he was hospitalized emergently at Denver Health, doctors recognizing psychosis and placing him on an antipsychotic medication that he remains on to this day. And you can look at these periods of time like bookends. Bookends to the mental illness, bookends that are critical in the analysis and evaluating mental illness. It's the history, it's the timeline that is so critical. If you drop into someone who suffers from schizophrenia's life for 6 months, for 8 months, and you try and make judgments about that person, they can be inaccurate because you don't have that full life history. And what I would like to do is I would like to spend some time talking to you about the time before Mr. Holmes was accepted into the University of Colorado. Then I'd like to talk to you about the time that he spent at the University of Colorado. And then I would like to spend time in depth talking to you about the months and the weeks leading up to the events of July 20th. That was a time when James Holmes was psychiatrically much sicker, when he was increasingly losing the ability to control and to defend against his most aggressive symptom of his schizophrenia, which was his delusional thinking. James Holmes clearly experienced symptoms and signs of mental illness as a child, and you will hear that schizophrenia does not hit all at once. Schizophrenia and the symptoms, they quietly enter one's life. They can slip in, and for James Holmes it was no different. You heard that he had homicidal thinking as a child. He had thoughts about these sort of nuclear winters, these vague thoughts that were a coping mechanism to stress and to suicidal thoughts. And you'll hear from an expert, and they'll tell you that experiencing that as a child is highly unusual and can be an indicator of a major mental illness. You also may have heard, but will hear, that Mr. Holmes, even as a child, felt that there was something wrong with his mind, something wrong with his brain, and he wanted to find a fix for it, which is why he wanted to study the brain, or neuroscience. You'll hear over the years that Mr. Holmes was quiet, awkward, shy, and those types of outward appearances are completely consistent, fully consistent with the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. The negative symptoms are the symptoms that appear while that disease of schizophrenia is revving up, like sniffles or sneezes before a full-blown cold. And they don't debilitate someone. So you do hear and did hear about Mr. Holmes, successfully completing high school. He spent time playing soccer. He got into college. He successfully graduated from college. And the experts will talk to you about a few concepts related to schizophrenia that are important to talk about up front. First of all, there's no single presentation of schizophrenia. If somebody knows somebody with schizophrenia and says, oh, I know what schizophrenia looks like, they don't, because we're all so uniquely different. And the disease will affect each individual who it strikes differently, just the same as any other disease. The symptoms that the person experiences, the intensity of the symptoms, the way that the symptoms may interact with each other, all of that can be different for different people, which is why there are periods of good times and bad times, good days and bad days, even good hours and bad hours. You'll also hear from the experts, they'll talk about how James's intellect interacted or fit in with his mental illness. Because certainly James Holmes was genetically gifted with a high IQ and genetically cursed with a family history of pervasive and serious mental illness. And those two things don't cancel each other out. They coexist. And you'll hear one expert describe James's intellect and the way that it interacted with his schizophrenia by using a metaphor of a large gas tank. It's like a large intellectual reserve. And it takes a longer period of time to get to empty. And James will get to empty. And it can take a longer period of time for people to notice those signs and symptoms of mental illness. But as Mr. Holmes enters into his 20s, a time of psychiatric significance for the disease of schizophrenia, and certainly a time of psychiatric significance for Mr. Holmes, you do start to see the more pronounced effects of his disease that's now revving up and going into high gear. Others begin to notice the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and you heard the prosecution refer earlier to some of those graduate programs that didn't accept Mr. Holmes. And Mr. Holmes was experiencing decline in function. He did not get into a number of graduate schools when he was a senior in college and applied. Now, for someone not that interested in science or doesn't test very well, that wouldn't be a decline in function. But for Mr. Holmes, with the academic trajectory that he had and the ease with which he had in taking written examinations, regurgitating that information, one would expect him to get into those graduate schools, and he did not. So for Mr. Holmes, that was a decline of function, which is a red flag or an indicator of schizophrenia. The other thing is at age 22, he's living with his parents in the same town that he essentially grew up in and was working at night in a pill coating factory. Now for some, that's not a decline of function at all. For Mr. Holmes, with his academic trajectory and where we think he might be at the age of 22, also a decline in function and also an indicator of schizophrenia. But there's fluidity within the disease. There's fluidity within the negative symptoms, those shyness, introversion, social awkwardness, the things that Mr. King spoke about earlier. There's also fluidity and movement within the psychotic process that we'll talk about in just a bit. But Mr. Holmes did experience an uptick, and he was accepted into the University of Colorado graduate school when he was 23 years old, and he left his job, painting pills, his night job, and he came to Colorado in the spring of 2011. Mr. Holmes came to Colorado as a 23-year-old man, and he was looking forward to graduate school. You heard that he recognized as a child there was something wrong with his mind and he wanted to find a fix for it. And this was one step in that direction, the neuroscience program, or the study of the brain. His goals when he arrived were simple: a life of science, a life eventually perhaps with family, and to find a fix to quiet his mind. His arrival in Colorado marked a concerted effort against his struggle against what we now know to be schizophrenia. And an expert will describe both when he arrived as well as the first few months that he's at the university as a time where he is more psychiatrically intact, somewhat healthy, where he's able to find the internal strength and organization to remain present, somewhat present in reality most of the time, and able to function in daily life. And tragically, his ability to remain in reality changes dramatically over the course of his time at the University of Colorado. But during this time, during the first few months, he attends classes. You'll hear that he goes to attends school functions like the retreat to Keystone, Colorado in the fall of 2011. And you'll hear from his professors. You'll hear from the people who sat next to him in class. You'll hear from people who observed him in class giving presentations. And they'll describe him similarly to the observations you heard earlier, but more pronounced. He was very quiet. He would never initiate conversation in a social setting or a classroom setting. Extremely awkward, would say odd things at odd times. So much so that they thought it was just nerves related to an admissions interview, but it did not decrease even as he became more familiar with the school and more familiar with the people in it. Mr. Holmes during this time explains to a doctor that he tried harder than he has to overcome that social phobia that he'd experienced for so many years, that social anxiety he experienced for so many years. Again, that being consistent with those negative symptoms or the symptoms of schizophrenia that take place while the disease is revving up. During this period of time in the fall of 2011, he found several friends, fellow students in the graduate school, and found a girlfriend. His first romantic relationship at the age of 23. He communicated with his family, his parents, by email, sometimes on the phone. And you heard his parents' nicknames. This is an email in the fall of 2011. Hey Goober, thanks for the goodies. All is well here on the eastern front of the Rockies. Also at the end of September, the neuroscience students get to go to Keystone Resort in the mountains, which looks really fun, while the lodging and expenses are paid by the program. I hope you're doing fine and that your thumbs aren't too green from botany. Jimmy. Jimmy is his nickname within the family. Hey Bobo, this is an email to his father, and also in the fall of 2011. Yeah, the clouds came this way. Classes are okay. The exams are take-home, which is kind of weird. There's 6 neuro students and 3 other med grad students that are partly in the program. Jimmy. In that photograph is actually a photograph that was a mouse pad that was in his apartment on Paris Street. And his Paris Street apartment looked no different from any other graduate student. Filled with books, clothes, a snowboard, bike fix-it kit, video games, and a college man's cookbook filled with recipes that at the age of 23 brought with him to Colorado. So how do these tools, these pencils, these pens, the eraser, the calculator, tools that are so familiar to Mr. Holmes and have been his entire life and were for the first year that he was at the University of Colorado, how and why do they turn to these tools? Guns, gear, tools meant nothing but for destruction. Brand new tools and foreign tools. And how and why does this 23-year-old graduate student with his entire life in front of him, who loves his family loves him, who is talented, how and why does he become the only suspect in the indiscriminate shooting deaths of men, women, and a child? And the reality is that in the upcoming months, in the spring of 2012, James Holmes experienced a mental break, a psychotic break. He was living in reality, but his mind was divorced from reality, and that break escalated through the months of the spring and into the summer of 2012. His thinking was diseased. his thoughts were telling him things that weren't true, and his thoughts were telling him that he was in a life struggle that had no basis in reality, didn't exist in reality, but to him, he believed it with every fiber of his being. When he stepped into that theater on July 20th, his thoughts and actions were consumed by his disease. His thoughts and actions were not driven by choice. They were driven by his delusion, his most aggressive symptom of his illness, and driven by disease. And when he stepped into the theater on July 20th, his mind was so diseased, it could not make that choice based on an ability to distinguish between right and wrong. So how do we get there? How do we go from 0 to 180? The experts will bring you squarely to the winter of 2011. The winter of 2011, James returns from winter break and he's sicker. He's physically sicker in that he had just been diagnosed with mono and was treated in California, but those symptoms resolved within a month or two. He was psychiatrically sicker. His depression was worsening, it was deepening. His social phobia turned paralyzing. He could get the words out in class, but he was filled with anxiety all of the time. His symptoms of his psychotic illness are worsening. He turned 24 years old a few weeks before he left for winter break. And this is an inner struggle. And he is now at the peak age of onset for a psychotic break. And the experts will tell you that is what he experiences in the early months of 2012. That break from reality, that divorce from reality with his mind. He's still interacting on a daily basis with reality, but his mind is breaking off from reality. This is also a time where his obsessive thoughts are increasing. His homicidal thoughts are increasing. His coping mechanism as a child and these thoughts about nuclear winter that come along with stress and thoughts of suicide, he's experiencing those and they're increasing. And some may ask, well, why now? Why did he experience this psychotic break now? Some may question the experts on that. And some will tell you, with his genetic susceptibility, in the years of negative symptoms, he hit the peak age of onset. This is going to happen. It's inevitable. And some may tell you, Dr. Metzner, for instance, the court-appointed doctor mentioned earlier this afternoon, that this psychotic break was triggered by psychological stressors. Stressors that included the eventual, in a few months, breakup with his girlfriend. That was a big loss. It was a cordial breakup. There was no dramatic thing that happened. But for him, that was a big loss. It's not a motive, but a psychological stressor that may have triggered the psychotic break. The difficulty that James was having at the University of Colorado. So he was now in graduate school with much smaller classes, and the classes required participation, and they required student presentations, and he'd come from University of California, much larger, big classes. He was good at test taking, good at writing things down, good at regurgitating information that way. But you could be lost in the anonymity of such a big school, and University of Colorado was much different. And with his social phobia, and with his disease progressing, and with his social phobia becoming paralyzing, that was a significant stressor, also a psychological stressor that could have precipitated the psychotic break, or could have certainly precipitated more severe symptoms that we'll see. And when I talk about a psychotic break, what I'm talking about is a time where you see that more pronounced symptoms of psychosis that you might think about and know more about perhaps in the negative symptoms, things like hallucinations. James would see shadows. That wasn't a very pronounced symptom at this time, but it gets much worse, as you saw, into November of 2012. But he does begin experiencing hallucinations and seeing shadows in the early months of 2012. Delusions, okay? Thinking that something is real that is not, that is fixed, that you believe in. And psychotic thinking, thinking that doesn't make sense, it's illogical, it doesn't really have a place in reality. Now, with all of this going on and his thinking becoming more delusional and more psychotic, and no one will ever be able to tell you with specificity when Mr. Holmes experienced his first psychotic thought, when he experienced his first delusional thought. That would be like trying to tell someone stricken with cancer when that first cell became unhealthy. But the experts will identify this period of time in these months as a time where he's experiencing delusional thinking. An expert will tell you that his thoughts at around this time begin hardening into delusions and delusional systems, and his delusions expand. And what his thoughts are about and what he is focusing on are thoughts of life and death and value and purpose. And all of that is volleying around in his mind as he's experiencing this break. And those thoughts are bouncing off of each other. And he begins to believe in this human capital delusional idea that by killing others, he can gain value and acquire worth. He believes that by killing others, that fundamentally will change his life. And the experts will agree that that is delusional thinking, that he truly believes that there's no other explanation for it, that that is delusional thinking, and they've come at that at many angles. But James Holmes, in the midst of this, does what any of us would do. What he's experiencing now is unfamiliar. What he's experiencing is powerful. He seeks mental health help. And this wasn't about Mr. Holmes. On February 26, 2012, he searches on his computer, nervous breakdown, and he asks to have a mental health appointment with the University of Colorado Mental Health Services. And this wasn't about someone looking for some help for just some social phobia or a setback socially or breakup with his girlfriend. He's managed social phobia and anxiety for almost a decade. He's certainly experienced social setbacks here and there. What he's experiencing at this time is new, and it's unfamiliar, and it's powerful, and he's losing control. The coping mechanisms that he would use to quiet his symptoms, to quiet those thoughts, the video games, the music, the focus on schoolwork. His schoolwork wasn't making him sick. His schoolwork he wasn't having delusional thinking about. And so those things he could use in order to escape or to quiet the symptoms of his mental illness, and those weren't working against these more aggressive symptoms he was experiencing as a result of this psychotic break. Over the course of the next 4 months, James Holmes is seen 8 times by mental health professionals with the University of Colorado. And I'm going to talk about these sessions individually, but I want to talk generally about the importance of his mental health treatment at the University of Colorado and tell you exactly why it's important. His first session is with Margaret Roth, and she's a social worker. She sits down with Mr. Holmes and recognizes there is something wrong. She recognizes signs of mental illness and refers him to a board-certified psychiatrist right away, who sees him within days. Dr. Fenton sees James over March, April, and May, and then she seeks her supervisor's help and brings in Dr. Feinstein at the end of May. And the importance of his treatment at the University of Colorado is really twofold. First, we have documented medical record of his mental state, very close in time to the shooting in July. It's not as though he saw a single doctor in March or years before and were trying to figure out what was going on in his mind at the time of the shooting on July 20th. We have documented medical records. Medical records, unlike memories, can't change, they can't be misremembered, and they can't fade away. So documented observations of people who know what they're doing, people who are experienced. And what that can do for you is that can give you this concrete timeline of his deteriorating mental health and deteriorating mental state that you can then connect to his upcoming behaviors and actions. We don't have to make a guesswork about his mental state. We have mental health treatment up until a month before the shooting. Mr. Holmes sees social worker Margaret Roth on March 16th. That's his first meeting with a mental health professional. And in this first session, he tells her that he wants to kill people. He reveals homicidal thinking. He's experienced it for a long time, and this is the first time that he's revealing it to anybody. And this is also the first time that he's seeking voluntarily help. Also, Margaret Roth recognizes immediately, within 40 minutes of sitting down with Mr. Holmes, she doesn't know him. He's a stranger to her. She doesn't know the genetic susceptibility or the life history or the change over time in his negative symptoms or the way he appears to others. And she recognizes he is the most anxious guy she has seen, has symptoms of OCD, and immediately refers him on to a board-certified psychiatrist, Dr. Lynn Fenton. You can walk around and you can observe people with serious mental illnesses interact with the world, but it's not until they sit down in front of you with someone who knows what they're doing and asking the right questions and talking about the things that they're sick about, not the things that they're not sick about, where that curtain to mental illness opens. And that's exactly what happens. She spends 40 minutes with him. Dr. Fenton sees him within a few days, on March 21st. And they talk about his life history, and he reveals that in bizarre thinking, that in 5th grade he got glasses and wanted to overcome biology. But the significance of this session as well is that to Dr. Fenton, he explains that he is having homicidal thinking, thoughts of wanting to kill. He explains to her that the solution to the biological problem would be to eliminate the problem through homicide, but can't kill everyone, so not an effective solution. He is seeking mental health help. He's having these experiences. He's talking about these experiences and trying to get help for them. He reveals that he's having these thoughts 3 to 4 times a day, and that his obsessive compulsive disorder symptoms are the worst they have been. This is all layering in on what I just spoke about when you returned from the winter break of in early 2012. And he explores his homicidal ideations with Dr. Fenton. And Dr. Fenton, after meeting with James Holmes for probably about an hour, a stranger to her, without knowledge of the family history, without knowledge of the life history, without knowledge of the decline in function in the early 20s, recognizes, suspects psychotic level thinking. She's right. But the first meeting, she suspects psychotic level thinking. And this is just 4 months before July 20th. Within a few days, Mr. Holmes expresses his delusional beliefs, his delusional idea about human capital, and you saw this earlier. This is a G-chat with his girlfriend from graduate school. And she asks, what is so evil that you want to do? And he expresses, kill people, of course. That is why I live in the future. He's expressing this. He describes human capital. Some people may make $1 million, others $100,000, but life is priceless. You take away life and your human capital is limitless. And at the same time that he's having this delusional thought about value in life and purpose, he's also beginning to experience delusional thinking or illogical thinking about death and life. He believes that there is now no demarcation whatsoever between life and death, that there's no separation, that pre-birth, post-death, it is all the same. And the doctors will talk to you about this G-chat. Dr. Metzner, the court doctor I mentioned earlier, he was stunned when he saw this G-chat, stunned by its content, stunned, and he believes that this is evidence of delusional thinking. All the experts agree. This is delusional thinking. He's expressing it. Now, what's also significant about James Holmes' expression of this idea of human capital that he believes is real, and his thoughts, his disease thinking is telling him that he is in a life struggle that has no basis in reality, but that this is a way out of that life struggle. But his expression of the idea, as he's getting psychiatrically worse and psychiatrically sicker, he believes that if you express something, if it exists outside of your body, you are compelled to act. And as he gets psychiatrically sicker, his defenses lessen, and he becomes more vulnerable, and believes that since this is outside of his body and it's delusional thinking, that he needs to act on it. And that's a compelling thing as he becomes more vulnerable, as he becomes more sicker. Now, I told you that when Dr. Fenton saw Mr. Holmes, just within a first session, she recognized the signs and symptoms of mental illness, pointing towards psychotic thinking. She also, in that first session, prescribed an anti-anxiety medication, an SSRI, by the name of Zoloft. And Mr. Holmes began taking the medication on March 21st, and within 4 weeks, Dr. Fenton increases the dosage 2 times. So by April 17th, the dosage is tripled. And James takes a medication as prescribed. He is beginning to have sort of psychotic and delusional thinking about his treatment, about his mental health. He believes that the medication will somehow fix his brain. And this is following an experience with a lab rotation that was mentioned earlier, this lab rotation where he didn't do very well. His stress about that lab rotation not going very well was a psychotic stress. That lab rotation occurred during this critical time frame from November to February, November of 2011 to February of 2012. And I'm sorry to digress from the medication, but this is important. And he did perform worse in that lab rotation than he had in his first lab rotation. That's decline in function seen with schizophrenia. But the issue with that lab rotation was that he had placed a psychotic level of importance on it, thinking that that lab rotation was going to fix his mind in a way that he thought studying the brain would fix his mind. A lab rotation is not going to fix somebody's mind. That was a delusional thought. It was a thought that didn't have any place in reality. But that was a psychotic, it was not a lab that was studying mental health or mental illness. And so when that went poorly, and you'll hear the experts describe that as a decline in function, then he places the same sort of psychotic level of importance on medication. But this anti-anxiety medication, this SSRI, is increased, and he takes it as prescribed. And this is the type of medication where you have to pay attention when you start it and when the dosage is increased and when you end it for changes in thoughts or behaviors and actions. And it can cause mania. It doesn't cause schizophrenia. It doesn't cause mental illness. But it can, for some mentally ill people, cause mania. And within just a few days of beginning the medication, and on the day that it's doubled, you see this dramatic increase in spending. Mr. Holmes drops $4,000 into a retirement account. You see within a few days of the dosage tripling, he makes another big expenditure and buys a computer. This is someone who typically spends about $1,200 to $1,600 a month. Frugal. If you look at his credit card transactions from May of 2011 and then a similar record for May of 2012, his spending has quadrupled. And for July of 2012, it's astronomical. It's approximately $7,700. It's also at this time, he describes in his notebook feeling brief periods of invincibility. Actions are in hyperspeed, developed in the last 3 months and occurs typically 3 or 4 days a week, lasting all day with periods of catatonia. And so where else are we seeing some sort of hyperactivity or evidence of mania? Well, social anxiety reduces in May for the first time in decades. And you saw that exchange that he had with a classmate in April of 2012. That was unusual for him. He was flirting. The content of the texts were unusual in that just the ease with which he communicated with her. For the first time, on April 20th, he signs up for Match.com. For someone who is so plagued with social phobia, and has been his whole life, and everyone agrees that he was, and was very socially awkward and had a difficult time communicating with others. That's unusual. And then you'll see within a few weeks, or excuse me, a few months, it escalates to XXXmatch.com and adult friend finders. Complete aberration. You don't see anything like that. And then even his login history for the computer records or the match activity in July is consistent with what he's describing in his notebook. You'll see he's logging in not that many times, but when he does log in, it's in the middle of the night, in the middle of the day, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the day. So it shows the computer records show these periods of time where he must be up all the time, and then periods of time where his activity is greatly reduced, which is consistent with how he reflects this invincibility in the notebook. But he continues with treatment in the spring of 2012, and the treatment is important in that we've got this documentation from Dr. Fenton. He is guarded and paranoid. He has increased obsessive thoughts. He's now angry that the doctor won't tell James about her purpose in life when she's told him when he's told her all of his. So you see purpose, that theme, that delusional theme that we saw in the G-chat, flooding into the meetings with Dr. Fenton. And now it's not a question mark anymore. What she is seeing is psychotic level thinking. These are medical observations by a board-certified psychiatrist months before the shooting. So they're not made up after the fact. And she's wondering whether or not he's suffering from a frank psychotic disorder. She has now met with him 4 times, 2 medication sessions and 2 longer therapy sessions. She's right. She is seeing a frank psychotic disorder. She doesn't know the genetic susceptibility or the negative symptoms. May 1st, looks silent and sullen. Reveals that his biology betrayed him on a hike. Is not giving coherent answers when asked about homicidal ideation. And he tells Dr. Fenton, you have an unconscious and that makes you do things. He's beginning to express having both an impaired ability to mentalize the states of mind of others, or to take in what we may normally take in if you see someone look quizzical. You might think, oh, they might have a question. He doesn't have, he's losing the ability to do that, or doesn't have the ability to do that. And he's also taking in a significant meaning to innocuous life events. For instance, and this is a general explanation, if you see a red car on your way to work, you feel like you have to do something when you get to work. He's beginning to experience this, and the important part of April and May is he is not getting better. He's being treated and he's being medicated, and he's not getting better and he's not stabilizing. Psychiatrically, he is getting worse. And what do we have happen at the same time? When Mr. Holmes is not in Dr. Fenton's office and not in class, what do we have going on at the exact same time that we have documented psychotic level thinking, that we have this tripling in the dosage of the medication? We have changes in mood. And we have documentation that his psychiatric condition is going downhill. What happens at that time is we have these dramatic changes in his interests and behaviors and activities. Around May 10th, on the heels of Dr. Fenton recognizing psychotic level thinking and wondering whether we're talking about a frank psychotic disorder, we have purchases that were described earlier, but he's going from purchasing occasionally sushi and textbooks and having gym memberships to purchasing tear gas and guns and ammunition and handcuffs and knives. He's going from his Huffy bike in a 2001 Hyundai to taking motorcycle classes. And this is all happening now at the exact same time. All of this other information is documented about him, and as his mental state is declining and deteriorating. And the significance of the deterioration is he's becoming less and less capable of defending against these more aggressive symptoms of his schizophrenia. And it's now controlling his behaviors and controlling his thoughts, and the delusional thinking, this belief that he is in this life struggle, and the way to get out of that life struggle is to kill others because that will bring you value, that will bring you worth. That is dominating his mind. You'll hear that over the course of May, he does make those purchases I just described. And he will still go to a therapy session on May 30th, and he participates in a therapy session on June 11th. And during this time, he submits paperwork to the school. That's required for the next semester. During this time, he receives an email from Dr. Klug about Dr. Klug wondering whether or not asking for James to meet with him about the upcoming lab rotation. Within a few hours, he finds another lab advisor. And you may ask yourselves and wonder why, if he has a plan firmly in place, why is he doing that? Why is he talking to Dr. Fenton about his homicidal thoughts, but not talking in more detail? We're not talking about the human capital delusion. And what you'll hear the experts talk about is psychotic ambivalence. Psychotic ambivalence is where, for James, he wants to be stopped at this point, but he cannot be stopped. He cannot be stopped because that plan, that goal, that belief that his life struggle will end with killing others and accumulating their value, it's a lifeline to him. He needs that as much as people need air. And so he wants to be stopped, but he can't be stopped. And that's psychotic ambivalence, and you'll hear about that during the course of May. Dr. Fenton brings in her supervisor. James Holmes is not getting better. He's not stabilizing on medication. And Dr. Fenton brings in another psychiatrist. And they meet and they do a talk therapy session. And James reveals he's not studying for prelims. He's going to take his preliminary examinations based on his natural state. It is highly unusual. He has dedicated himself to study. This is aberrant behavior. This is unusual behavior. This is new behavior that's taking place as he's psychiatrically deteriorating and in the midst of this psychotic process. Dr. Fenton does not reveals that she does not think that James has a sense of what others think about him. Mr. Holmes agrees to come and talk more with both Dr. Fenton and Dr. Feinstein. This is May 30th of 2012. So we're now close to the month before the shootings. Dr. Feinstein tells James that he couldn't really prevent suicide or homicide in the long run if a person is intent on it. And that statement has psychotic devastation to James, and the focus and the importance that he's placed on mental health and medication in particular, fixing his mind and getting rid of all of his thoughts of homicide and getting rid of all of his thoughts, all of his thoughts about everything that he's delusional about at this time. And we can see that there is this significant decline in his mental state. We can see that through the mental status examinations. One is done at the first session in March, and another mental status examination is done in June of 2012. And we see a significant psychiatric decline, and it's just right there in the record. In March, affect appropriate. In June, affect anxiety, hostility, inappropriate, odd, and bizarre. In March, thought process, logical and goal-directed. Thought content without delusions, perceptual without hallucinations. In June, thought process, intermittently odd and hard to follow. Thought content, paranoid delusions and preoccupations. Perceptual, denies hallucinations but does glance about the room in an odd way. He's experiencing these shadow hallucinations. In March, axis 4. So where do we see any decline in function or difficulty functioning? It's blank. In June, everything is filled out. Axis 4, impairment, financial, environment, housing, occupational, relationship, failing grades. His psychiatric picture, his mental illness, is taking a nosedive, and because June 11th happens to be the last date that there is a medical record before the shooting, doesn't mean that his mental state plateaus or gets any better. It continues to go down, and we see that, and that's why Mr. King focused on what happened after the shooting in the jail.
10 minutes, thanks.
Thank you. And in June, the last statements of Dr. Fenton, he seems more paranoid. His ability to mentalize about other states of mind is very impaired, and he may be on the autism spectrum, may be shifting insidiously into a frank psychotic disorder such as schizophrenia. And this is his last meeting with Dr. Fenton, because after this therapy session, he does meet with his advisor. He has not passed the preliminary hearings and voluntarily withdraws.
You stopped seeing them at some point. I'm trying to think of the order of the appointments. You kept every appointment that was made, as I recall.
Yeah.
Okay. But at the last appointment, you communicated in some way that this was going to be the last.
This was the last one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as I recall, you even left a little early. This is it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's
okay.
accurate.
Why did you make that your last appointment?
I don't know why.
If there was a wish to fix you, or to, on the one hand, fix things, fix your mind, and on the other hand, prevent the mission from taking place, prevent the track that things were on, to stop that.
Yeah, kind of overruled the treatment.
It overruled the treatment.
Yeah.
Pretty strong force.
Yep.
Where does such a strong force come from?
I don't know. It just took hold of my mind.
I'm sorry?
Took hold of my mind.
Took hold of your mind. There are some pretty strong forces that take hold of people's minds sometimes. The impulse to drink for alcoholics, to shoot up for heroin addicts, to do other things.
Yep.
Any thoughts about why this took such irrevocable hold of your mind, such unbeatable hold of your mind?
I don't know why it dominated, but it did.
That's James Holmes speaking with Dr. Reed, approximately 2 years following July 20th, and understand that he's very medicated, but he's describing the mission, the belief, his delusional thinking, his belief that by killing others he will acquire worth, and this will eliminate the life struggles, took over and dominated his mind in June and July. Just took control. It was such a powerful force. And now we have a period of isolation because he withdraws from school. He no longer is with classmates, teachers. No longer he's cut himself off from girlfriend, from friends, from his family for the most part, with the exception of emails. And now he's just within his head with those thoughts. These are the observations. This is what's going on with Mr. Holmes in the months leading up to July 20th. In Paris Street apartment, the end of June and into July turns to this. As he psychiatrically deteriorates, he believes that he is in this life struggle. It is a battle for him. He writes about that in his notebook. This is not a streamlined thought process regarding homicidal sort of action, the way the district attorney described earlier. This is a mess of disorganized thinking when he's thinking about homicidal act and acting this out to alleviate this life's struggle. He is looking at armor and umbrellas that are lethal and swords. This is disorganized. This is a mess. This is his mind, and this is his diseased thinking. Books about bombs, death by toxins. Ultraception, it's referred to in the jail records, it's referred to in the notebook. Ultraception, it's not in reality. It's a symbol. And the planning that you see is not inconsistent with insanity when it's all directed towards a delusional goal. When it's in furtherance of a delusional goal, and all of his actions at the end of June into July, he is focused on the theater shooting at that time, but it is all planning directly related to that delusional goal that all the experts agree is a psychotic symptom, it's a psychotic thought. I want you to ask yourselves that, if James Holmes concealed in any way his purchases through using a false name or through using cash or having a dummy address or storing these things, the things he accumulated in a storage shed, district attorney would argue that those were things that those were things that showed he knew what he was doing was wrong. He did none of those things. Used his name, identifying information, paid with a credit card that gave a paper trail back to him. And in July, the floodgates are open. He exchanges that text with a friend who reaches out to him from school, his former classmate. He tells his former classmates, floodgates open now, and that's how he was in July. His mind was completely dominated with this delusion. It was dominated to complete a goal that had absolutely nothing logical to gain, and he was dominated and had marching orders to complete a final act that accomplished no goal in reality. In this constellation of thoughts and this delusional thinking propelled him over the next few weeks. And the best evidence of his mental state over the next few weeks of what was going on in his mind is his notebooks, now that he's cut himself off from everyone, or the notebook that he sent to his psychiatrist. To understand this case, you need to understand mental illness and being inside of psychotic thinking and inside of delusional thinking that's impenetrable to reason and logic. James Holmes did not choose this mental illness any more than a child chooses to be born with brain damage or an elderly person chooses to be stricken with dementia. When James Holmes stepped into that theater, his thoughts and actions were consumed by his disease. This was his reality. This was his life struggle, and this was going to alleviate that life struggle. And when he stepped into that theater, his thoughts and actions were no longer driven by choice in his vulnerable and sick psychotic state. And when he stepped into that theater, his thoughts and actions were driven by delusion, and his mind was so diseased that he did not make that choice based on an ability to distinguish between right and wrong. And that why may not feel satisfying, may not feel rational, and you have to be prepared for that. The why is coming from James Holmes' mind. He is sick. And irrational thoughts and beliefs are the product of a mentally ill mind. So even though there is a why, you have to be prepared for that why not to make logical sense to you. At the end of this case, we are going to ask that you return a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity.
Thank you, Ms. Spangler and Mr. King. Folks, I know it's late. I want to take just 5 minutes to remind you that there are rules you must follow. These are the same rules that jurors have always had to follow. During the trial, this courtroom is a place partially isolated from the outside world. Your decisions must be made inside this place, and you must follow its rules. You must make all decisions in this case based only on the evidence presented in the courtroom and the law as I instruct you. You must avoid any other information about the case from any other source. These rules are designed to make sure that there is a fair trial. There are two basic rules, as you know. Number one, you must not communicate with others or among yourselves about the trial as it is going on. Number two, you must not do any independent investigation or research about the case. I'm going to discuss these two rules in further detail. You must not discuss the case among yourselves in any way during the course of the trial. You may not discuss the case among yourselves until after you've heard all the evidence and you begin to deliberate on a verdict. In fairness, you have to keep an open mind throughout the trial, and you may not form any opinions about the case or reach any decisions until I tell you that you may start deliberating on a verdict. Do not permit anyone else to discuss the case with you or near you. If anyone, including one of your fellow jurors, attempts to do so, report that fact immediately to one of my staff members. And all you should do, if that happens, is just indicate to one of my staff members that you need to talk to me. Don't go into any specifics. Do not talk with any witnesses, parties, or any of the attorneys who are involved in the case. You cannot talk to them, and they cannot talk to you even casually. Do not communicate about the case with anyone else in any way, including in person, by telephone, cell phone, smartphone, iPhone, BlackBerry, computer, the internet, or any internet service. This means that you must not email, text, instant message, tweet, blog, or post information about this case or about your experience as a juror on this case on any website, listserv, chat room, blog, or websites such as Facebook, MySpace, LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitter. You must not read, review, or accept any communications in any form from anyone regarding this case or cases like this one. Therefore, you may not mention that this is a criminal case or the charges that have been filed in this case. You are permitted, however, to explain to family, friends, and employers that you are on a jury, and then you can inform them that we anticipate that this jury trial is going to last 4 or 5 months. You cannot say anything else about any aspect of your experience until you are released from your jury service. You cannot be investigators outside your courtroom. Attempting to get further information outside the courtroom would be unfair to the parties and would be a direct and serious violation of your oath. Do not attempt to gather any information on your own. Do not read or research about this case or this kind of case from any other source, including the internet. Many of us routinely use the internet to research topics of interest. But you may not do that with respect to this case. You may not use Google, Bing, Yahoo, or any other type of internet search engine to learn about any person, place, or thing that is involved in this case. That includes the defendant, the attorneys, the witnesses, your fellow jurors, and the court personnel. This advisement applies whether you're here at home or anywhere else. Please do not read about this case in the newspapers or on the internet or listen to any radio or television broadcasts about the trial. The law even prohibits you from consulting a dictionary with respect to this case or in relation to this case. Do not attempt to visit any places mentioned in this case. Finally, do not in any other way try to learn about this case or this kind of case outside the courtroom. I said finally, let me just add again, you cannot form any opinions about the case. You cannot start deliberating internally in your own minds until I tell you that you can start deliberating on a verdict. You have to keep an open mind throughout the proceedings, and you have to keep in mind that Mr. Holmes is presumed innocent, and that presumption stays with him throughout the trial and has to be given effect by the jury throughout the trial. All right, with all those admonishments, I am going to release you at this time and ask you to be back tomorrow morning at 8:15, okay? Thank you very much, folks. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom now. Is there anything that we need to take up at this time from the prosecution, Mr. Brockler?
No, sir.
Is there anything on behalf of the defense, Mr. King?
No, Your Honor.
All right, have a good evening. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Let's plan to be here at about 8:30 with the plan that we'll start at 8:40. Thank you. The court will be in recess.